Might remind everybody that's watching on Zoom that if you haven't already prepared some elements for communion, you might want to go ahead and do that. And one other thing I thought I'd mention. So you've heard me talking about John Reeves and I were working on starting a podcast. Oh, let me take this off. John and I started a podcast, and the part of the purpose of that is just to also have a time in the week for a little discussion and reflection for church members. But we're using Zoom, and if you're interested, I think we're at the point now where people could go ahead and tune in. We've been kind of practicing and going through figuring out technical stuff, but at 6:30 on Tuesday evening, if you want to click on the church link, it would take you to our little podcast, and it's me and John sitting in their sun porch, just having a conversation. We start out just having a conversation. And the subject is the most recent week's sermon. We get started talking about, insights that we have that come from what I was talking about in the sermon. And and then after a while we'll open it up to conversation. So that would be Tuesday at 6:30, and just go to the church link, and if you're getting it on Facebook Messenger or wherever you might get it, or if you need it, I can send it to you. All right, and we can certainly use your support and prayers, to get this thing going. I think it has the potential to be something special and really bless people out there, because John and I just have pretty honest conversations. But it's
and
also
we never go off topic.
Deeper into what it is that I talk about on Sunday mornings, and maybe air some questions that you might have about it. Had a good conversation with Christian after church last week, and he had some feedback about my sermon, because there was something that I had said in the sermon that he heard very differently than how I had intended it. And Christian understood that, so he wanted me to know how he heard it. And I really appreciated that. So then we had a good conversation about what he was hearing and what I had intended, and it made for a richer sermon because of that. So our second reading today is from John chapter 21, and we're continuing that process of the story of Jesus' resurrection and what happened after it, and according to the gospel witnesses. And here we are in the Gospel of John. Now, last week I told you about Thomas and how he wasn't there when Jesus first appeared to the disciples, and then he doubted and said, if I don't see him myself, I'm not going to believe. And then he got to, and Jesus said, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed, because there's going to be a lot of those. And how that scene, when you read the Gospel of John, it looks like that should be the last chapter. It's like John intended that to be where it ended, and then he said, I got more to tell. And this is the more. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, which is the Sea of Galilee. And in this way he showed himself. Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, James and John, and two others of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, I am going fishing. They said to him, we are going with you also. So they went out and immediately got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. Now, when you think about it, you got to think about this for a while. Okay, they went and got in the boat. They knew where their boats were that they haven't been using for maybe 3 years. It's been a while since these guys went fishing. They caught nothing. But when the morning had now come, Jesus stood on the shore. Yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Then Jesus said to them, "Children, have you any food?" They answered him, "No." And he said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast, and now they were not able to draw it in because of the multitude of fish. Therefore that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." The disciple whom Jesus loved, we understand to be John, the author of the gospel. He refers to himself that way a lot. Said to Peter, "It is the Lord." Now when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it, and plunged into the sea. But the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from land, but about 200 cubits, dragging the net with fish. Then as soon as they had come to land, they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid on it, and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish which you have just caught." Simon Peter went up and dragged the net to land full of large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the net was not broken. That's an interesting detail, because this same thing happened to them years before when they first met Jesus, and the nets were breaking. And they had to call their partners to come over and help them. Jesus said to them, "Come and eat breakfast." Yet none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" knowing that it was the Lord. Jesus then came and took the bread and gave it to them, and likewise the fish. And this is now the third time Jesus showed himself to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
I was thinking about all the changes that we've been through in the last 2 years since the great pandemic began. How different things were. Just 2 years ago, just a little over 2 years ago, you go back to the early March of 2020, and so much was so different. Much has changed in our church life, too. And there were things we were doing in March of 2020 that we no longer are, some of which I miss. But there are things that we have not yet begun to do, which now we do regularly. And for months now, the one pandemic-related question I've heard the most often is, when will we get back to normal? And I've come to realize that the answer is never. We will probably never get back to some version of normal that we remember from the before time. But that doesn't mean we can't look forward with excitement and anticipation. Because God, who was with us in the before time and has been with us all through our in-between time, will be with us in the after time, whatever that will look like. God will still be with us. Now, certainly Jesus' disciples were asking similar questions, and they were filled with similar longings during their in-between time, which was that time between the dramatic events of the Passion Week, his arrest, death, and then resurrection. What came between that and what was going to come after? There was a real time of transition and uncertainty for them, and what they were asking was, when will we get back to normal? And the answer was, never. Not normal like it was. But today's gospel shows them actually trying to make that happen. To go back to the same old, same old. A small child was outside one night looking up at a full moon, and he asked, "Mommy, is God in the moon?" And she said, "God is everywhere." And then he asked, "Is God in my tummy?" "Well, sort of. So he responded, not sure where these questions were leading. And then suddenly he declared, God wants a cookie. How intimately is God involved in your life? You feel his presence daily, even in the seemingly trivial and mundane matters? One of the apparent purposes of John's final chapter is to show how the impact of the resurrection of Jesus moved from the extraordinary, outside normality, into the common and ordinary, which was kind of the intent. By this point, all of the disciples knew that the Lord had risen from the dead. They'd seen him, they'd talked with him, they'd experienced this, and now they were asking questions about what this was going to mean. What was their role going to be now as followers of a risen Christ who was different? What were they supposed to do now? They put their whole lives into being his disciples, following him. They left everything and followed him. And now everything changed. What are they supposed to do? Now, the first post-resurrection appearances of Jesus to them had been around Jerusalem. They'd been near the tomb. They'd been behind locked doors in the upper room. They'd been on the road to nearby Emmaus. And all of this, for most of the disciples, these were unaccustomed venues, far from the familiar, and they were now associated with fear and anxiety and stress. But now Jesus came to be present with them in the old and familiar, ordinary places of their former lives. And he had told them to return to Galilee and that he would meet them there. So now 6 of his disciples are together on the familiar shores of the Sea of Galilee. They've arrived back at home, but where is he? They've had this great revelation, this awesome experience that has changed their lives, but now it seems like everything is back to normal. And where is Jesus? He's not here. We can't go look for him. Where do you look for him? So they just have to wait. And suddenly Peter says, I'm going fishing. And there's an abruptness about it, a sense of frustration. Time is passing. And Peter decides the best thing he can do is what he did before he met Jesus, which was fishing. As an old Zen proverb says, before enlightenment, I chopped wood and carried water. After enlightenment, I chopped wood and carried water. For them, this is the same old thing. This is where they had lived and worked before Jesus met them. This is where he called his first disciples, and this is where he made his home during his public ministry. This was all very familiar. And it was here on a morning much like this, when Jesus had come to Capernaum preaching the good news of the kingdom of God. And a crowd had gathered, and he borrowed Simon Peter's boat and went out a little way into the lake to preach from there. And afterward he told Simon, go out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch. And Simon said, we've been fishing all night, and we've caught nothing. But Jesus insisted. And so they went out, and they had this huge catch, so much that their nets were breaking, and their friends had to bring their boats to help pull it in. And Simon fell down at Jesus' feet and said, depart from me, for I am a sinful man. But Jesus said, do not be afraid. From now on, you will catch men. And from that day, they left everything else to follow him. Now Jesus reveals himself to them again in this place, this familiar place, this common occupation that they were so familiar with. But now it's different. This is the risen Jesus, risen from the dead, glorified, changed. The scenery hasn't changed. The activities of life are the same as before, but things are not the same as they were 3 years earlier. Because for one thing, the disciples have changed. They're not the same. And Jesus himself has changed. Now it seems like there's this great gulf between them. The friend, the teacher who they had sat with and ate with and talked with and walked with, he seems very, very distant from them now. But in every word, in every act, Jesus seems to try to diminish that gulf. To make them see that just as he walked and talked and ate with them before, he would still walk and talk and eat with them. He would laugh and cry and work with them. He would be concerned about their needs. Jesus builds the fire and cooks the food and sits down with them to share it. When we recognize Christ in everyday life, it means same old is not the same. Fishing is never so exciting as when Jesus is there. Now fishing, which before for them was just an occupation, not something they did for fun, something they did for work. Now it's something more. It's a symbol. Jesus has made it into a symbol of a higher calling. And it's one that Jesus had already suggested on the day he first called them, when he said, I will make you fish for people. They're fishers for people. And the net of God's kingdom is going to be big enough and strong enough to hold all that are gathered in. Now, on that earlier occasion, when they first met him, they were slow to recognize who Jesus was. Now they're again slow to recognize him. And how often are we slow to see Jesus? Slow to see him hidden in plain sight. Or when we do recognize that he's there, in the events of our lives, we're afraid to say anything about it because others might think it's silly. Or they might just say, oh, that's just coincidence. So we need to look for Jesus, and we need to be ready to acknowledge him when he's there, to acknowledge the miracles and the wonders and moments of grace that he makes happen in our lives. Brother Lawrence lived in France in the 17th century, and he entered a monastery at the age of 55. I thought that was pretty cool, because I was just about my age. I'll be turning 55 in August, and Brother Lawrence, at the age of 55, went into the monastery and he was assigned to the kitchen, where he was, in his own words, Lord of all pots and pans and things. And there among the dirty dishes, Brother Lawrence worked and prayed, both at the same time. He learned to believe that God was with him at all times, not just in great and profound moments of worship or doing exciting works for God that people will remember and praise, but at all times. The time of business, he said, does not with me differ from the time of prayer. And his friends wanted to know the secret of his cheerfulness, so he reluctantly wrote down his thoughts. He called his practice an habitual, silent, and secret conversation of the soul with God, whom I consider as always with me. And what he wrote down became a book called The Practice of the Presence of God, which is one of the most well-known devotional works of all time. Practice the presence of God. Now there is more to this last story in John's Gospel, because the story begins, though not obviously, with one member of the group suffering. And you can see it in his words and his actions. And that person is Simon Peter. He's restless. He's troubled. He can't be still. He's got to do something. And then he's ecstatic. He's full of joy. He has to jump in the water and swim to shore. Big swings of emotion. Well, they've all been through a lot, but Peter has a special burden that Jesus rising from the dead did not take away. Because Peter denied Jesus 3 times the night he was arrested. The night before he died. He said he never knew him. Now Jesus addresses that suffering. So when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." He said to him again a second time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Tend my sheep." And he said to him the third time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" He said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." Jesus lets Peter know that he's forgiven. 3 times. Takes away each of those denials. He's accepted again. But he also has a task. Feed my sheep. Tend my sheep. And this task is not really any different from what it was the moment Jesus called him. He said, "From now on you will catch men." His task is to extend that acceptance to others. To make God's presence that he has felt because of his closeness to Jesus real to others. Christ is present on the beach. He's present at the table. He's present in our work and in our play and in our various callings to serve him and serve others. In an issue of Central Region Life, our former Associate Executive Minister, Steve Van Ostrom, reflected on Mel Gibson's 2004 movie, The Passion of the Christ. And he talked about how one man had used his vocation, in this case filmmaking, to tell the story of Jesus. He said, wouldn't it be wonderful if every Christian would find a way to tell the story through his or her vocation? In our face, our tone of voice, our attitude, and the quality of our work, as well as those moments when we actually have a chance to talk about, to witness in words. What would happen, he said, if the bricklayer did her job in such a way that every brick laid was done as if it were part of the next great cathedral? What if every nurse treated his patient as he would Jesus on the bed? Martin Luther saw a potential calling in any kind of work, even dirty and unpleasant work, he said, such as shoveling manure or washing diapers, is pure and holy work if it comes from a pure heart. So if we think of Jesus taking part in the routines of our lives, then we realize that Christ might appear in those things at any moment, in some way. So it's all transformed. We begin to see the deep meaning in Jesus' words in Revelation. Behold, I make all things new.